I'm Madison, 28 years old. 3 hours ago, I sat in a Fayette County courtroom watching my own mother, Tiffany, and my father, Jeffrey, try to convince a judge that I was too delusional to manage my own life. They weren't just after the $16 million in inheritance. They wanted the $60 million stallion portfolio I spent a decade building. Their lawyer smirked, waving fake medical records like a victory flag. He had no idea that I was already 3 steps ahead, ready to turn their greed into a very expensive lesson. Welcome to Sibling Scars and Revenge. Have you ever felt like you're invisible in your own family? Please, share your story in the comments below. Just like right now, I'm out for a drive to find some peace of mind. What about you? Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'd love to connect with you. When the judge announced a 15-minute recess, the room erupted in a low murmur of gossip. Tiffany leaned over the mahogany railing, her eyes scanning me, with a look that was supposed to be pity, but felt like a predator, measuring its next meal. She dabbed a non-existent tear from her perfectly contoured cheek and whispered that it was for my own good. Jeffrey just stood there, arms crossed over his silk tie, nodding like he was the one making a difficult sacrifice. I didn't cry. I didn't even look at them. I walked out of that courtroom and straight to my vehicle, parked in the shade of the courthouse elms. I didn't need a hug or a glass of water. I needed clarity. I opened my laptop and felt the hum of the cooling fan against my legs, a clinical, reliable sound that contrasted with the suffocating drama inside. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I was the primary trustee, the person my great-grandparents, Margaret and William, had actually trusted to carry their legacy forward. But I wasn't just a name on a piece of paper. I was the only genetics expert with the master key to the ranch's proprietary DNA database, the literal blueprint for $60 million worth of stallions. My parents thought they were suing a girl. They forgot they were attacking the chief executive officer of the very empire that funded their existence. I logged into the server. My fingers didn't tremble. They moved with the precision of an accountant closing a ledger. First, I activated a total system lockdown. As the sole trustee, I triggered a protocol for a breach of fiduciary duty. In one click, an administrative freeze was set, turning the master key against them. Every researcher, trainer, and barn manager lost access to the high-security stables. More importantly, Tiffany and Jeffrey were scrubbed from the digital registry. They were no longer Morrison Farm family. They were strangers. Then, I opened the secondary financial portal. I watched the live transaction feed and almost laughed. There it was. 2 pending first-class tickets to Saint-Tropez, booked just 12 minutes ago, using the ranch's emergency maintenance fund. Their grief over my supposed mental breakdown was apparently going to be managed poolside in the French Riviera. I clicked cancel on the flights. Then I systematically deactivated every secondary credit card linked to the primary trust. I watched the status bars turn from green to a cold, flat red. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and today the account was closed. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. By the time the bailiff called us back into the room, Tiffany and Jeffrey wouldn't even be able to pay for their parking, let alone a getaway. This wasn't revenge. This was accounting. I closed the lid, took a single breath of the humid Kentucky air, and walked back into the glass house trial. It was 12 minutes past the hour. The retaliation was complete. Now, it was time to let the truth do the rest of the work. As the bailiff's voice signaled the start of the second half of the hearing, I felt the familiar weight of their eyes on my back. Tiffany's perfume, something cloying and expensive, drifted over the gallery. It smelled like the childhood. I never had all surface, no substance. My parents sat there, radiating the polished arrogance of Kentucky old money, but all I could see was the dust of Barn 3. Let me take you back to where the ledger actually started. 10 years old. Winter in the bluegrass region isn't a holiday postcard. It's a bone-deep, slicing chill that turns stable muck into jagged glass. While Tiffany was busy being the queen of Lexington at various fundraisers, I was knee-deep in that muck. My hands were cracked and bleeding from hauling frozen water buckets to the yearlings because the heater in the North Stable had failed, and Jeffrey didn't want to waste the gala budget on infrastructure. People often look at the overlooked child and ask why they stay. They see the emotional distance and the blatant favoritism, and they wonder why we don't just run the moment we can. But they don't understand the invisible chains of the survivor. It was a prison without bars, a psychological state called learned helplessness. I had been conditioned to believe that my only value was my utility to them. I was the useful daughter, the one who handled the grit while they showcased the glory. I spent 20 years as an unpaid extra in their family drama, paying in sweat and blood for a seat at a table where I was always an afterthought. But Jeffrey and Tiffany made a critical error in their accounting. They assumed my silence was a sign of weakness. They thought I was a broken tool they could discard once the trust fund hit my account. What they didn't realize was that my silence was a tactical choice. I wasn't waiting for a mother's hug or a father's approval. I had stopped that transaction at age 12, when I realized their love was a currency they only spent on themselves. I was a survival strategist. I was waiting for the precise legal alignment of dates and documents. I was waiting for the clock to hit 25, then 28, the milestones William and Margaret had set to ensure the empire wouldn't be liquidated by my parents' incompetence. Grandmother Margaret and grandfather William saw exactly what Jeffrey and Tiffany were. They saw a failed land contractor and a social climber with a hollow bank account. They didn't leave me the $16 million and the stallions out of a sense of obligation. They left them because I was the only one who actually knew the horses' names. I was the only one who understood that a legacy isn't something you display, it's something you defend. Every insult Jeffrey and Tiffany hurled at me in that courtroom today was just another entry in a balance sheet I had been perfecting for 2 decades. They thought they were the architects of my life, but I was the one who had built the fortress around their greed. As I watched the judge pick up the first of my financial records, I realized the debt was finally being called in. The air in the courtroom shifted the moment we sat back down. Jeffrey's phone buzzed in his pocket, a notification from the bank. I watched from the corner of my eye as he pulled it out, his thumb swiping frantically. His face turned a mottled shade of purple, the exact color of an overripe plum. He leaned over and whispered to Tiffany, whose eyes immediately darted to me, sharp and venomous. They had just realized their Saint-Tropez escape had been liquidated before they even left the state. But my parents didn't do what normal people do when they're caught stealing. They didn't apologize or try to negotiate. They doubled down on their ledger of lies. If they couldn't have the $16 million quietly, they were going to burn my reputation to the ground to get it. By the time the afternoon session ended, the social guillotine was already in motion. Tiffany hadn't been crying. She had been texting. In the insular, high-stakes world of Kentucky old money, a rumor moves faster than a Triple Crown winner. They blasted the Lexington Country Club circles with a coordinated assault. The narrative was simple and lethal. Madison is a secret, degenerate gambler. She's been siphoning the farm's profits to cover her debts. And the worst part? She's the reason the champion stallion, Great Ambition, died last spring. It was a calculated strike against my identity as a scientist. Great Ambition was a $5 million animal, the pride of the Morrison legacy. They claimed I had been negligent during a genetic treatment, effectively labeling me a killer in the industry. I sat in my vehicle afterward, watching the notifications flood my own screen. Friends I'd known since childhood were blocking me. Potential clients for the Stallion portfolio were sending terse, one-line emails, withdrawing their interest. Jeffrey even went on a local livestock podcast, his voice cracking with fatherly concern as he told the host that I needed professional help and that the family was just trying to protect the horses. It's a specific kind of psychological phenomenon, the trap of normalized cruelty. My parents had spent 28 years convincing themselves that because they gave me life, they were entitled to harvest my success. In their minds, they weren't the villains, they were the victims of an ungrateful child. They casually viewed my inheritance as a form of back pay for the perceived burden of my existence. This is the narcissist accounting. They overdraft on your soul for decades, then claim you're the one who owes them interest. They thought the social pressure would break me. They thought if they isolated me from the bluegrass elite, I'd come crawling back, checkbook in hand, begging for a family I never truly had. But their accounting was flawed. My compassion had been a luxury they'd long since exhausted. They were trying to use the social guillotine to force my hand, but a blade only works if you're willing to put your head on the block. I wasn't. I was busy hiring a team that spoke a language even louder than Lexington gossip, the language of forensic accounting and federal law. Instead of engaging with Tiffany's frantic texts or trying to explain myself to the country club board, I hired a firm that didn't care about reputations. I brought in an independent audit team and a group of forensic accountants who specialized in high-stakes corporate embezzlement. I didn't want a shoulder to cry on. I wanted a scalpel to find the rot. While my parents were out there performing for the cameras and weeping about their troubled daughter, I was busy weaponizing the truth. We set up our base of operations in the library of the main estate, a room that still smelled like the pipe tobacco Grandfather William used to smoke. For 3 weeks, we lived on black coffee and raw data. The silence in that room was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the loud, messy lies my parents were spreading in Lexington. I wasn't being reactive. I was being proactive. I wasn't a victim of their gossip. I was the architect of their downfall. The paper trail was a map of their long-term failures. Jeffrey hadn't just been a bad businessman. He had been a clinical thief. We found the primary bleed in the ranch's maintenance fund, $850,000, diverted over 5 years. Every time a stable roof leaked or a fence needed mending, Jeffrey had told me the budget was tight. Now, I saw where that money had actually gone. It hadn't gone to the horses. It had been used to cover the interest payments on a series of disastrous strip mall developments that were currently $3 million underwater. I spent my nights scrolling through spreadsheets, the cold blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family breakdown. It was a balance sheet. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and tonight I was finally calling in the debt. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. By the time we were finished with the first phase of the audit, I had officially transformed our drama into a massive financial fraud investigation. I called my lead attorney, a woman who specialized in white-collar crime and didn't believe in family loyalty, as a legal defense. I didn't ask for her opinion on my parents' character. I handed her a thumb drive containing documented proof of embezzlement and told her to coordinate with the district attorney. I'd been the invisible creditor for too long, and it was finally time to call in the debt with interest. I'd watched them treat the Morrison legacy like a personal piggy bank, while they mocked the very person who kept it solvent. But the audit was revealing something even darker than embezzlement. It was a pattern of accounting that moved beyond simple theft. My parents weren't just stealing from the past, they were sabotaging the future. As we dug into the digital signatures on the latest stallion contracts, we hit a wall of forgery that turned my blood cold. The ledger was already heavy, but I didn't realize how deep the ink of their crimes really ran. My forensic team flagged a series of encrypted outgoing emails from Tiffany's private server communications that had been masked using a virtual private network. As the genetics expert for the Morrison estate, I managed the most valuable inventory on the planet, the purebred DNA of champion stallions. My parents saw horses, I saw biological patents worth $60 million. We bypassed the encryption and found the smoking gun. It wasn't just embezzlement of maintenance funds. Tiffany had been engaged in systematic wire fraud for the past 18 months. She had forged my digital signature, the master key of the primary trustee, to authorize the illegal sale of genetic material from our prize stallion, Midnight Legacy, to private breeders in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. I sat there, in the dark library, watching the transaction log scroll by. 14 separate shipments, $2,400,000 in black market payments, routed through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. This wasn't just family drama, it was a federal felony. By selling those genetics without a breeding license or a valid contract, she had effectively nuked the exclusive value of the Morrison bloodline. She hadn't just stolen my money, she had sabotaged the legacy of William and Margaret for a quick payout to fund her failing vanity projects. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon the daughterly horror I was supposed to feel, but there was only the cold satisfaction of an auditor finding a terminal error. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. Tiffany hadn't just overdrafted on my compassion. She had committed a breach of $1 billion genetic supply chain. In her narcissism, she believed that if she couldn't control the empire, she had the right to scrap it for parts. I didn't call her. I didn't send a warning text. I simply downloaded every forged document, every wire transfer confirmation, and every thread of the illegal negotiations. This was the lethal discovery, the kill shot, that removed any remaining path to redemption. They weren't just ungrateful or toxic, they were criminals, operating on a global scale. I closed my laptop. Outside, the moon hung over the bluegrass fields, quiet and indifferent. My parents were likely at home, drinking expensive bourbon and planning their next attack for the morning court session. They thought they were going to prove I was too unstable to hold the keys to the kingdom. They had no idea I was about to hand those same keys to a federal prosecutor. The balance sheet was finally complete. Tomorrow, the debt wouldn't just be settled. It would be enforced by a prison cell. The atmosphere in the courtroom the next morning was stifling. Tiffany sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a string of pearls and a look of practiced maternal concern that no longer had any power over me. Their lawyer stood up first, adjusting his silk tie with the kind of practiced ease that comes from believing your opponent is already beaten. He began a long, winding, closing argument about my unstable emotional state and the family's sacred duty to protect the Morrison legacy from my delusional management. I didn't listen to the performance. I was looking at the judge. Judge Mitchell wasn't interested in the theater. He was waiting for the accounting. When it was our turn, I didn't make a speech. I didn't cry about my childhood. I simply nodded to my attorney, Mr. Piton, who presented the findings of our independent audit and the private investigator's report. We started with the grand larceny, the $850,000, diverted from the ranch maintenance funds. Then we moved to the kill shot, the federal wire fraud, and the systematic forgery of my digital signature to sell Midnight Legacy's genetic material on the international black market. I had already sent the encrypted files to the district attorney's office the night before, waiting for this exact moment to let the trap spring shut. As the digital logs and bank transfer receipts from the Cayman Islands appeared on the large monitor, the smirk on the opposing lawyer's face didn't just fade, it vanished. Tiffany's face went a translucent shade of white. She looked at Jeffrey, but he was staring at the floor, his hands trembling so violently he had to hide them under the table. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the judge flipping through the evidence of their $2,400,000 illegal operation. Judge Mitchell slammed his gavel down with a force that made the pearls on Tiffany's neck jump. His voice carried the weight of a hammer hitting an anvil. "Stop these proceedings immediately," he commanded, his eyes fixed on my parents with a look of pure loathing. "Someone call security." Since the district attorney's office was briefed last night and has officers standing by, I am referring these documents for immediate criminal processing. There is documented evidence of felony fraud and grand larceny here. As the bailiffs entered the room, Tiffany lunged toward me, her eyes red with the mixture of terror and desperation. "Madison, please," she hissed, her voice cracking. "We're your parents." "We're family. You can't let them do this. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything." I didn't flinch. I didn't look for regret in my heart because the account was empty. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single notarized document, the formal notice of housing termination. Under the trust bylaws they had signed years ago, their residency was strictly conditional on their fiduciary conduct, and that privilege had just been forfeited. I handed it to her across the railing. I already did, I said, my voice as cold and clinical as a lab report. The locks were changed 2 days ago. Your things are in barn 3. This isn't revenge, Tiffany. It's the final balance on a debt you've been ignoring for 20 years. This was the justice of the seed sower. I realized then that my victory wasn't about their destruction. It was about the protection of the future. True justice isn't just about punishing the past. It's about clearing the weeds so that something healthy can finally grow. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the guardian of the legacy they had tried to scrap for parts. I watched them be escorted out, realizing they weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were only shocked that I'd finally stopped footing the bill for their version of family. The fallout for Tiffany and Jeffrey was swift, clinical, and completely deserved. In the weeks that followed the trial, the state attorney general's office moved with a speed that suggested they wanted to make an example of my parents. They were ultimately charged with felony wire fraud and grand larceny. Because they had spent every cent of their own money maintaining their social status and couldn't pay the $16 million in restitution, they were forced to sell every designer suit, every piece of jewelry, and their fleet of luxury cars. They moved from their pristine townhouse into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a part of Lexington they used to drive through, with their windows rolled up. It was a bitter reversal of the comfortable life they'd built on the backs of others, but I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I simply felt the relief of a closing ledger. 6 months after the trial, I stood on the porch of the main house at Morrison Farm. The bluegrass fields were a deep, vibrant green, stretching out toward a horizon that finally belonged to me. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore, the useful child waiting for scraps of affection. I was the steward of a legacy that was finally safe. The first thing I did with my freedom was establish the Margaret Foundation. It wasn't a public relations stunt or a tax write-off. I created it to provide legal aid and educational scholarships for children in the foster system and for young, aspiring veterinarians who, like me, were more comfortable in a stable than a ballroom. I wanted to help others break the cycle of being used by the people who were supposed to protect them. I've come to realize that family isn't about bloodlines or shared DNA. It's about character, integrity, and the people who actually show up for you when the water buckets are frozen and the wind is howling. For 20 years, I believed I was the burden, but I finally understand that my compassion was a luxury my parents simply couldn't afford. If you find yourself in a similar situation, please hear me. Don't wait for them to see your worth. They won't. You have to be the one to draw the line. Build your own pasture. Create your own boundaries, your own legal and emotional boundaries, and never apologize for protecting your soul. Forgiveness is something people talk about, like it's a requirement. But sometimes the most healing thing you can do is to walk away and never look back. I found my peace in the silence of the North pasture and in the eyes of the horses, who never cared about my bank account. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be, and watching them fade into the background while you're busy building something beautiful. That isn't just a win, it's justice, taking its natural course. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more true stories about family, money, and the courage it takes to stand up for yourself. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.